We're going to invite on stage the guys who know an awful lot more than me. Hopefully on screen, we're going to get Shivam up and we're going to get Simon Whitmarsh-Knight up. So whilst we swap over things, I'm just going to go through a brief slideshow to attract why I invite Katie and Adam on stage. So just to remind people, just like if it was a baking challenge and I asked people to bake me a certain type of banana bread and I gave them the ingredients, everyone would come up with a different solution. Recycling is exactly the same. There are different ways to apply it. I think this understands all of our position. I don't think anyone would agree to this. We all buy far too many textiles. So Katie and Adam, please do come on stage. That's to make Eric feel particularly guilty because that is France's textile. Thank you for accepting responsibility. This is from Karen Egberg, those people who know her at Leadership and Sustainability. Look at the impact at Tier 4 and Tier 3. That's where the big impacts in our textiles chain are, not actually what we do ourselves. I'm hoping the tech boys, are you going to put up Shivam and Simon Whitmarsh-Knight, please, so they can join in the conversations? This is a slide that I nicked from the Outdoor Impact Summit. If any of you were there last summer, absolutely brilliant. Katie's responsible for it. We need to talk more about going over planetary boundaries. All these slides will be uploaded and on the website within a couple of weeks with my droning on. We all know this and what it communicates about global warming. Can I advise you, also look at the loss of biodiversity, which is this slide. Compare the two together. We have solutions. I believe Riju have made the slide, so you're obviously making an impact. But what I want to say is that it's really, really complex. There are different models that we can apply. I call them Dante's level of hell, doing how far down or how far up you go. You can see how recycle comes almost towards the end. And two final slides. I think this sums up where we are. We have enabled Sheen to exist. But if I come back to a line I've already said, my biggest hassle is the churn is the concern. And at that point, because I've reached toilet humor, I come off stage. I'm hoping. Oh, Mark, can you grab a mic for Katie, please?
You can finish.
Okay, Mark, I'll pick up a secondary mic. I'm going to hand it over to Katie, who's going to run the session for the next 3/4 of an hour.
What time do we finish? Great. So I don't think we have Shivam or Simon just yet. So we'll wait for them to get them online. I mean, oh, here they are. I might just move my chair so I can see what's going on. Yeah. Okay, so all the panelists are here. We can see everybody now, so that's much more. We can go back now, Adam. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining this session. Thank you for a great introduction, Charles, giving us the facts and figures around what is or what isn't being recycled. I'm joined by 3 experts who know a lot about textile recycling. So before we start the panel, we'll just do a quick round of introductions. So just one minute or so from each panelist on kind of why you're here and what kind of level of expertise you bring to this conversation. We'll start with Adam because he's here, and then we'll move on to Shivam and Simon.
Thanks, Katie. So my name is Adam. Try again. My name's Adam Gardner. I'm a recycled lead at Textile Exchange. For those of you who aren't aware of Textile Exchange, we primarily run and operate a number of standards within the textile supply chain. Most relevant for this is the Global Recycled Standard, or GRS, as well as RCS. Both of these standards are driving action to certify recycled systems And these certifications across the organisation are used within 90,000 sites globally within the textile supply chain. Yeah, so that's me.
Great, thanks, Adam. So we'll just hear from Simon.
Thanks, Katie, Adam. Excuse me, I hope you can hear me all. And thanks, Charles, for that excellent introduction. Really good to get some controversial things in, as well as mentioning Nirvana and Dante, all in one introduction, Charles. That's fab. But I'm Simon. I look after sustainability for Hyosung. For those of you not aware of Hyosung, we're the largest manufacturer of elastane by market share. Excuse me. And a significant supplier of recycled multifunctional polyester and nylon. So I'm in complete awe of the other participants of this panel, and including you, Katie, who bring such intellect and insight to the discussion. So what I'm hoping to bring, Katie, in answer to your question, is perhaps more of a commercial lens to our discussion from here. So thanks to you and to Charles and to Lisa for organising. It takes a lot to get this together. So appreciate you getting us all together.
Moving over to Shivam.
Perfect. Thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. I am Shivam. I now work as an independent consultant supporting different brands, innovators, primarily supply chain partners, mostly with the decarbonization work and impact assessments. And I'm going to try to bring in somewhat of the technical perspective and somewhat of the impact perspective from my previous work in the wastewater sector, which is effectively just recycling of a waste stream to get something valuable out. And I'm going to try to translate learnings from there and how we can learn from that in the world of textile recycling. Okay, but thank you so much for having me.
Perfect. So now we'll talk a little bit. I think what I'd really like to do is just to set the scene, so to kind of lay the groundwork for what we're talking about when we talk about the recycling industry. And I believe, Adam, that Textile Exchange is responsible for the 1% figure. So obviously you have a lot of knowledge about kind of what the lay of the land looks like. Could you just give us a little overview of what the current textile-to-textile recycling situation is? And so kind of what is operational today, what's scaling, and just so that we know what's going on.
Sure. Yeah, I think Charles did a great job of introducing that initially, but we've recently been working with Reverse Resources and Fashion for Good on a landscape analysis of the current textile-to-textile recycling capacity. And I think it's important to comment that textile-to-textile recycling has been happening for decades, but primarily within natural fibres. So for recycling of wool and cotton through mechanical systems has and continues to be an operational part of the industry. In the mapping with Reverse Resources, we've identified 520 T2T recyclers globally who are already operational using, as we've said, mechanical or thermomechanical. But the challenge that we face is so many of the fibres and garments that we produce as an industry are blended materials, including trims or multiple materials as part of that garment. And that's where the challenge with recycling currently sits, that these garments can't be recycled through mechanical systems. And we're looking to more advanced systems that can handle this more complex waste system. And within the last few years, there have been a number of people who've entered market with solutions for this. Some of them are operational already. Some of them will be operational in the next couple of years. And the growth projected by these in terms of capacity is where we see a huge lift. That being said, the industry is producing over 100 million tons of textiles. So even with the scale projections that we see from textile-to-textile recyclers, there's still a long way to go. But the solutions are becoming operational.
Okay. I mean, I think it's interesting there as well, this kind of conversation around fibre recycling we can do, but then when we turn that into a garment, that's where it gets complicated and it gets tricky. And I think that really highlights the fact that, we're looking for systems change, not always. I mean, obviously we need technology innovation, but it's actually the system, the whole ecosystem that we need to change around that. And just thinking about kind of the data perspective, and I think I'm going to kind of hand over to Shivam here. How well do we actually understand the benefits of recycling compared to virgin fibre? Kind of where are we as an industry, and are we actually measuring the right things here?
Yeah, I think. I mean, to answer that, I think within recent times, I think there's been a lot of questions about if LCAs are reliable or are they covering enough things. I don't necessarily think it's the problem of the LCA itself. It's because we are not ready to go deep enough to get the data. And if you put in rubbish, obviously rubbish will come out. And of course, we're making assumptions, and everyone sits in their own silos, and nobody's willing to share. We say the textile industry is very fragmented. The textile recycling industry is heavily fragmented itself. Most solution providers don't want to work together for that matter. Everyone has a different baseline. I am 50% better than virgin nylon, and other one says I'm 40% better. But we don't know what the value for the virgin nylon they have taken. So we just guesstimating things here. So we don't know if it's better or worse, what the baseline is. And of course, within the impact side of things, for recycling, we need to understand there's three key things. There's displacement, there's yield, and then there's energy. If you don't displace anything, no amount of recycling does anything. You just keep growing at a slower pace. That's the only thing that happens. We have 130 million tons of material, and then you add more recycled on top of it. Sure, the industry impact is not growing as business as usual, but it's still growing. And our goal is to come down. So it doesn't really help. So no displacement, it doesn't really matter what the impact is. We can say goodbye to whatever we're trying to do. The next being yield, of course, from collection till fiber production or yarn production, all of it needs to be considered. And if you lose, let's say, half of the material from the ones you collected, as we've seen from the bottling industry and mechanical players and everyone else, we lose out a lot. So the impact almost gets doubled because you lost half of the material to produce that, as opposed to within the virgin side of things, it's been developed for a long time and it's quite stable. And then the third one being energy. If I have a small plant right now, let's say somewhere in Scandinavia, and I'm using renewable energy and I plug it in and my numbers are great and I do an LCA and I say, okay, this is the impact. But then my big factory is in India. The conditions change severely. Even if I could control for everything else, just the energy change is going to be humongous by a factor of 10, 20 at times. So basing your LCA from a very viable conditions wherein, it's optimized and everything's good in a lab scale reactor where you're controlling the reaction kinetics and thermodynamics really well. And then you scale it up and then you say, oh, the numbers will just go along. That doesn't happen. So we need to understand that benefits are conditional. They're not fixed. And unless we can get more transparency from the recyclers, there's going to be a constant battle in terms of if it's actually better for the planet or not.
Okay, yeah, I mean, obviously LCAs are a very important part when we are also talking about textiles, but we also obviously need to think about the waste reduction as well. And I mean, Adam shared a story earlier about his trip to Ghana last week. And I think anybody who witnesses the kind of the waste, I think they're always quite shocked at what that looks like. Just moving over now a little bit to kind of supplier and commercial side. So there's a question for you here, Simon. How ready is the market? I mean, is the market asking for recycled material? Are brands genuinely adopting what's coming? Or is there still a lot of hesitation around kind of within sales and purchase?
Yes, thanks, Katie. Firstly, thank you for mentioning systems as well and systems change. And Shivam, thank you also for using the English word humongous. I haven't heard that word for a long time, but it's a great word to describe the scale of the challenges we're all facing. So to your point, Katie, I think, I like to see things as systems, and, the scale of what we're all facing together is too big for one company, one organization to solve on our own. We need to work together. And that for me is one of the key themes of performance days, of this panel and other panels. It's that industry collaboration. So I'm sure we'll talk more about that as we go through and what that means specifically. So just coming back to your question, these are challenging times for all of us. We're living in this sort of VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous, and it feels really scary because it is sometimes. So, I try and being, a sales and marketing kind of guy, the glass is always half full for me, so rather than half empty. And I try and see the positives in all this. And I think despite these challenging situations, there are still plenty of opportunities out there for us. So looking at the bigger picture, to answer your question, yes, we definitely see a demand for recycled and recycling in the value system. Possibly because at the moment, maybe an easier story to tell to consumers than other stories that we may touch on later on, bio-based or mass balance or something like that right now. So, and we're responding to that, in line with legislation, I think, which will also help. So we are trying to respond to those requests and those developments in the market by looking at two areas, both bio-based and T2T recycling. You know, we want to support that move to circular business models. And when it comes to T2T, we're probably thinking about three clear strategies. One is our own technology internally. You know, what can we do with our experts and our knowledge to develop some T2T technology? And there'll be more on that next year. Second strategy is to support the startups. You know, we all hear of this terrible valley of death that, you know, startups have to go through, and we need more people, more ideas, more companies in the space so that we can have a better chance to succeed. So one of our other strategies is looking maybe at strategic investments in some of those startups. And then thirdly, you know, really there's our support for the scale-ups, those brands, those technology companies that are already in the marketplace. So, you know, we're really helping them get some scale and get faster adoption through the value chain. So we've already announced partnerships with Ambercycle, with Loop. There'll be others, you know, coming along, you know, next year. And really that they're good examples, Katie, of the collaboration I think we need, because, you know, we're not the only fiber spinner working with those companies. There are other spinners, and for us that's great, because the more people doing this, the faster the technology can be adopted, the quicker we can find the pricing solutions that the market is looking for as well. So long answer to your question, but we definitely see the demand. Market is moving and developing, and hopefully we'll find ways of collaborating more to make material change faster.
Perfect. Thanks, Simon. I think that was a very insightful response, actually. And I think we do need to keep coming back to this systems approach, because there's, you know, we've spent years making value chains that work in one direction, and obviously we need that same systematic approach in the opposite direction as well. But I mean, we've just talked about there are technologies that exist. We've just heard that LCAs can often be favourable, and we've just heard that there is actually a consumer and market pull for these fibres. So what I'd like to do now is just to dig a little bit into some of the challenges that we still see and what the realities look like. So, you know, if everything is in place, you know, why aren't we scaling faster, and what are some of the problems that we're encountering? Shivam, you mentioned earlier that as we scale up, the complexity of waste increases. Can you explain why this is the case and what that really means in practice?
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think as Charles was mentioning in the beginning, when he said, you know, we have this pre-consumer waste, of course, industrial waste, which is the offcuts, which is more of the cleaner parts that we have available. So, of course, most recyclers are going to start with that. And we know much more about those wastes because it's coming straight from the factory. So we know what went in. We can ask for the components and the materials and the chemistry that went in. So it's rather easy to understand what contaminants might be there. Of course, there can still be a level of contamination from unknown sources and, you know, not intentionally, but we still have much more control. But as all these companies would want to scale up, we have to move to post-consumer eventually. And then the pool widens significantly, because it's not just materials that you made this year, but it could be garments that you made 30, 40 years ago, maybe 50 years ago, if somebody has kept their garments for that long. All of those are going to come back. And if we just look at the chemical side of things, we made significant advancements over the last 4 or 5 decades to clean up our chemistries. We used to use very dangerous chemicals. If we just look at just dyes for polyester, if we take old polyester garments and we had a lot of dispersed dyes, some of them were very problematic, and we phased most of them out. But of course, if we bring them back, there is a possibility, of course, you can still do a lot of pre-treatment and pre-processing to make sure most of the chemistry doesn't come along, but some parts might remain. And of course, all of these additional steps adds to more complexity, and then you have to do additional treatments which require more money, more energy, more chemicals, more water, raises your impact further again. So then as we start to scale up, things start to become much more complex, and as it goes with entropy. So I think most recyclers do already have this understanding pretty well. Somehow their marketing teams maybe don't agree with it as much, but as they scale up, for the entropy of the system will start to grow. And what we maybe need to do as an industry is to maybe create some metrics for the entropy of a garment per se, of the things that we produce, so that we can understand that we don't just need to design in a certain way, we need to design in a way that keeps the entropy the lowest. So if you have a low entropy, you can potentially recycle it much easily. But if you have a high entropy garment, it's going to take much more energy to get it back into the system again. And that would just defeat the purpose of what you're doing. The one other challenge that comes along when you scale up is quality control becomes a big challenge. Smaller stages, we have deterministic quality control. Larger stages, we have probabilistic quality control. You can't test every single garment when you have 10 million garments coming in. If you have 50 garments coming in, you can potentially test all of them. So things will start to change significantly, and there is chances that other contaminants might come in. And some of the challenges with chemical recycling per se is because you do it in a batch with tons of materials all at once. And if you can't test all of it before, you're betting on the fact that your pre-processing was sufficient enough and it removed the contaminants. But if it missed out, the only way to find out is once you have done the depolymerization and you have a homogeneous mixture in a liquid state, you can then take a sample and then do the testing. But if it turns out negative, that whole batch is wasted. And of course, you can do an LCA based on just one of the nicer batches. But if in a month you do 100 batches and 70 work out and 30 fail, your overall impact has to be done for the 30 failed batches as well, not for like, oh, I'll just take a nice batch. Mm-hmm. So things will start to become complex. And of course, as you scale, the concept of economies of scale is widely said in the industry. There is no such concept of efficiency of scale. There is no guarantee that once you scale up the system, there will not be problems with efficiency or yield of the system. More complex input will come in, your reactor will grow in size, you have to control the heat, you have to control the kinetics, you have to control the byproducts being formed, you have to control catalysts being poisoned. A variety of problems come in. So once you scale up, things might differ and your efficiency might go down. So your cost is coming down, but you have less yield. It will kind of balance out to a certain extent. And none of those studies have actually been done on a large scale. So once we figure that thing out, then maybe we have a better path, and maybe the best option for the industry right now is to do more R&D to understand what will happen with these larger scale plants, and not just, let's put in $1 billion and see what works out.
Yeah.
That might not work out really well.
I mean, it's a lot of money. But I think it's an interesting perspective as well. And I think it also highlights that when we start talking about batches and yields, this also feeds into LCAs, and then obviously values can be quite fluid actually when it comes to LCA assessments. Thinking a little bit about kind of, obviously Textile Exchange do a lot around standards and GRS. What do you know about kind of what the biggest challenges are when it comes to things like feedstock availability and traceability, and how far have we actually come as an industry when it comes to verifying these things, Adam?
Yeah, I think it's important to contextualize for GRS standard and RCS standard is up to the recycler. So as an industry, we talk about engaging with tier 1 or tier 2, and some brands will be engaging with tier 3. And fortunately, we're seeing more now engaging directly with the recyclers. But beyond that, currently it isn't a system which is certified. As a development of our standard system, we're updating to a new standard system called Materials Matter. And as part of this work, we've launched a system which allows for traceability to the collectors. So this will allow recyclers to, on a monthly basis, report where that feedstock is coming from. But we need to be realistic that this is still only at a collector level, which is consolidating waste. And the reality of this waste, whether it is bottles, textiles, fishing nets, or any other feedstock which is used, is it's coming from informal sectors which aren't here to only serve the textile industry. So I think we need to be realistic, but we also need to recognize the people beyond our textile supply chain to support them and begin to first trace where it's coming from and then improve where we can do that. And it's an absolute cliche to say technology will help, but we are seeing as well with digital traceability of the transaction certificates, which allows us as well to do a volume reconciliation of what's going into a recycler and then what's going out. And this will be called the material ledger, and this will enable a greater traceability and also transparency of what volumes these sites are processing. But as I said, beyond that tier 4, there's very few organizations who really are knowing exactly where their textiles, or most likely their bottles, are being collected from at the moment.
Okay. And it's interesting that you talked about kind of like traceability there as well, because I think that brings us on to the next question that I wanted to ask, which is around kind of like policy and regulation. And this is a question for all of you really, because I think you're probably all seeing it from different angles and from different aspects. Obviously, there's a huge focus on many pieces of new regulation around traceability. But where do you see regulation in general playing a role in unlocking scale? So, for example, through minimum content requirements, I mean, you and I touched on this earlier. I couldn't remember the word, but that was the word. Or the circularity formula in the PEF, for example. So I'd be really interested in just getting your thoughts on, is policy a barrier or is policy a driver for the kind of changes that we need to see? I don't know who wants to go first. Adam?
Katie, I'm happy to go.
Okay, and we'll start with
before
Simon.
the others, if that's okay. No problem. Just very briefly to say, and there are too many three-letter acronyms for us to remember all of them and use correctly, Katie, but I think you're right. My personal view is we do need regulations to help nudge us in the direction that we need to go as a community. Okay, the context is difficult, it's challenging with all the things going on in the world. But I think certainly there is great value in those regulations which will help us move in the right direction. So, currently some of the value system is stuck in the mental model of, cheap clothing. And I think things like EPR will help us to move out of that mental model. But it will take time, Katie, because we're talking about behavior change, and that takes a long time to change and move in a different direction. But I'm a firm believer in regulations will help. We'll talk maybe towards the end of the session around collaboration and specific things we want to see the industry do. And then hopefully we all as consumers can do our little bit, no matter how overwhelming it feels. Sometimes we can still do a small bit. And as Charles has said many times before, it's better to do something to do nothing. And I completely agree with that. So, just my thoughts before we hear from the others.
Thanks, Simon. It's very insightful. Should we sorry, it's really hard moderating a panel with two people online. Should we move over to Shivam or to Adam? Shivam, yeah.
I agree with Simon. Of course, the legislation bit is definitely important. The one challenge that I see is I don't think the people making the legislation are necessarily involved very much in the whole textile space to begin with. Some of them, of course, most of them not so much. So they are being made, but I don't think they're being designed perfectly and well with all the mathematical calculations. Just taking EPR, and I wrote a big article recently as well. Fees are, first of all, not enough. If you just look at the numbers that the textile recycling industry is giving in terms of the funding they're going to require to set this up, several $1 billion, $5, $6, $7 billion need to come in. And if you look at the textiles being bought in Europe itself, and then you charge $100 per ton fee, it's nowhere enough for it to be. So this is the big challenge. If you start something, if you have a very ambitious goal and it's going to require a lot of money, and you say money is coming in, but it's not enough, you're going to have half-built systems, and we might fail much quicker. That's what's going to happen. You're going to promise something, and you're going to half-deliver on it, and it's going to be much disastrous, as opposed to not starting at all. Because so much money will come in from the private sector, recyclers will take big bets and everything else, but not enough will come in. And of course, the whole definition of EPR, I have big troubles with. The word responsibility loses a lot of meaning in that, because the brands are responsible, but they're going to pass the cost away to their supply chain or to the end consumer. So are they actually taking responsibility, or are they giving it because they're the biggest fish in the sea? So they come in and they will dictate terms. We recently saw this with tariffs. When tariffs got implemented, brands passed on the cost to the consumers. They did not take a hit on their P&L directly. Some of them, yes. Most brands did increase their prices. Why would that not happen with EPR? They're going to slightly increase prices or go to the suppliers and ask for more discounts. So it's not responsibility in the true meaning, and we're just stressing the system even more. Unless we can build safeguards or guardrails to make sure this works, I'm skeptical legislation is going to help out.
Perfect, thank you. Do you have some thoughts on kind of the circularity formula in the PEF?
Yeah, I think just one thing to add, I would say that we've seen in the last 8 to 10 years, whilst we definitely recognise bottle to textile isn't where we want to be, we have seen brands completely move their polyester sourcing away from virgin polyester. And they've done that voluntarily or through commitments they've made. But I do think there's something to recognise that we have seen a shift of industry, definitely not to the end state where we want them to be, but definitely an interim step which we can take some level of solace from. I think legislation is where it needs to be, and I completely agree with Shivam's point around making sure that policy decisions are grounded in realities. The research that we're doing with Reverse Resources and Fashion for Good is to inform the EU of what is realistic in terms of availability of fibre, both now and in 2030. And that 2030 number is still a projection. How many of the recyclers who are planning 5 or 6 factories to open in the next 5 years will get there isn't something that we can confirm. But nonetheless, policy needs to be grounded in as much data as we can. In fact, on your point around PEF and impact measurements, I think there's definitely something to be said. There's challenges within PEF, like without doubt, but one thing we've seen is the attribution of impact to the first and second life of garments potentially does shift the impact comparison of a bottle-to-textile fibre to a textile-to-textile fibre. And as we've heard, while LCAs are by no means perfect, we do often see higher impacts for more intensive processes. And it is about how we can bring in externalities, such as where that product has come from, to make that decision. So there's a hope there. The final thing I would say as well is how we can quantify but also acknowledge the human impact of these recycling systems. We talk about an LCA plus approach, which takes a social lens as well as these metric lenses. And I think that's really important whenever we consider decision making, is what are the impacts for people who are collecting these textiles, who are working in these supply chains. And whilst there maybe isn't a carbon number attributed to them, they're really important that we acknowledge and ensure that they're protected and their human rights are protected as well.
Yep. I think that's actually a really important point. And I was speaking to someone else this morning who's also doing a study on the impact, the social impact around recycling. So I think this is an area that we don't have much information on currently, but I think it's going to be the next topic that comes along. I just want to pick up on one thing that Shivam said and give a question to Simon. And Shivam mentioned around kind of the sustainability premium, and if we're talking about recycled fibres, you know, how do we manage that? And so Simon, do you have any thoughts on how brands, fibre suppliers and recyclers could actually work together to overcome the sustainability premium? What kind of conversations do we need to start having? And do you have any thoughts on how we can kind of manage this?
Well, so thank you, Katie, for the million-dollar question that everybody wants to ask. In addition to does this work, the next question is how much does it cost? So, I mean, it is a really important question. And I think obviously from a business perspective, for those of us investing in innovation, you know, of course, it's going to make sense for us to want to recoup that investment over time, because without that, we all know there is no further innovation. But I think we also then have to think somehow more creatively around that. And that's quite difficult because all the players in the system have different subjective value for different aspects. But we are seeing more of this, I guess, creativity in the supply chain in terms of how to manage some of these potential premiums. So brands and retailers, for example, are buying chips directly and then working with their value system to try to sort of ease out any, you know, pain points in terms of pricing. We're also talking to, you know, brands and retailers who are trying to balance out their recycled supply with maybe bio-based, because they know that the supply of, you know, recycled feedstock at the moment isn't quite there. So we're definitely seeing some creativity around that. Obviously, it's pleasing to see some of those recent offtake agreements. You know, we saw Loop with their factory in India agreeing with a large, you know, sportswear brand. We've seen Samsara, Lulu, Cirque and H&M, Ambercycle and REI. So there are positives there. But I think because there are so many players, Katie, and we all have, as I say, different value for different aspects of what we can do, at the moment there isn't one single solution. But maybe we'll come on to that as we bring the session to a close with some ideas about what we could do next.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe it's all about dialogue as well. Maybe that's one of the recommendations is, you know, keeping that open dialogue with the partners, with the ecosystem, and trying to solve this in a systematic way, not as one, and not putting the burden on one of the actors and one of the stakeholders, but actually everyone taking responsibility for that. So we've talked a little bit about kind of what's there and what the challenges are. I want to talk a little bit now, so to kind of sidestep over to kind of the real environmental outcomes of textile-to-textile recycling. And kind of link this to kind of the climate challenge and the climate conversations that we're having. So just one question to all of you, really. How should brands think about the trade-off between solving a waste problem and solving a carbon problem. And actually, what is the connection that we're talking about, and what does this mean for brands? So if anyone has any thoughts? Yeah, maybe Shivam, you've got something to say on this.
Sure. I mean, I agree with the aspect that we have to solve both problems, but I think we need to define which one is more critical in terms of survival as a whole. And I think I've written in the past as well, like, if you go to the hospital and you're having a heart attack and your arm is also broken, the doctor's not going to fix your arm first. He's going to try to save you and then maybe look at your arm, because if you die, there's no point if your fractured hand was fixed. This is pointless. And within our current cycle, let's say the global cycle for that matter, we have increasing levels of emissions going out, which are causing catastrophic problems, and most of them are going to likely be irreversible. So we're not going to have enough time. So we have limited years left wherein we need to solve for it. Waste is also contributing to that, not a doubt, but it's quite a small percentage for that matter. And if you keep, let's say, if you take polyester garments for that matter, and you throw them in a landfill, and you come back to them 50 years later, you would still be able to recycle them. If you have kept it in a controlled landfill in a nice condition, they're not going to go away anywhere. They're not going to disintegrate. Nothing's going to happen. So you can come back to the feedstock. But if you've added more emissions or carbon emissions into the atmosphere, it's extremely difficult to pull it back. Carbon capture and everything is just not going to work out anytime soon. Even if it does, it's not going to be big enough for it to be like, oh, we're going to pull out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So one is much more critical to us. The other is a problem we need to address, but we can come to it later. So, and the scale of this, and now I'm actually writing another paper as well, wherein if we are looking at circularity as a whole, how much resources we waste in the industry. And this I'm going to cover in my session tomorrow as well. If you look at the overall wastage in the industry, circularity should not be limited to just textile fibers. We have water, we have chemistry, we have labor, we have energy, and we waste millions or billions of tons of resources otherwise within the supply chain. How much do we actually care about the other resources? We're worried about just the fibers because we'll get it back and we'll sell it. Water is infinitely more important than fibers. Actually, one is for survival, one is just you sell more. But water is very cheap, so recycling it is not going to make you money. In all the $500 billion claims that we see, you can't make them with water. Even if you were to recycle all the water, 93 billion cubic meters, and if you take the cost of water in different producing country, maybe 100 million at best. So it's not a big number, but it's much more important. If you put the value of life to it, it's worth trillions of dollars, as opposed to this 500 billion, which is obviously not the opportunity, because I don't know how opportunities work. So if we want circularity, we need to widen our definition of what we call waste and what do we need to save in the industry. If we just wait saving fibers, sure, do all of it, and we're still going to end up with the same end result 30 years from now.
Thank you, Shivam. I have a few kind of finishing moves for everybody. But I think we're just going to take a couple of questions from the audience before we kind of wrap the session up. So, Charles?
So we've got one here from Slido. Anybody else? I don't know if we can get the QR code up again, but there's only one that's come through, and it says, we know what is virgin petrochemical fibres. Sorry, what is in virgin petrochemical fibres, but recycled versions have contaminants, even if we ignore the PFC hiccup. I am now reading that these added chemicals could leach back to their wearers. Will recycled yarns actually introduce a bigger hassle?
So the summary is?
I think, will chemicals such as the dyes that Shivam talked about, the old ones, is there a possibility that they'll survive the recycling process and perhaps leach back to the
So we're talking about legacy chemicals,
yes.
Yeah. So there's a question about legacy chemicals and whether they will survive the recycling process. So it's quite a technical question on the kind of functionality of recycling. Does anyone want to take it, Shivam? Or, I mean, we also have some recyclers in the room.
Yeah, I mean, if the recyclers want to answer, that'd be even better.
Yeah, I mean, I know that we have Reju here in the audience. So, I mean, do you have any comments on legacy chemicals?
Well, I think, first of all, we're talking in general about recycling technologies, and there's many of them, right? So it depends very much on the entire process that you have. But if you're focused on the molecule, if you're talking about polyester specifically, right, then you're not talking about natural fibers. The way to think about what you actually do, if you have a process like we have, you're essentially renovating the molecule, right? You're breaking the molecule back to the monomer and actually taking all of the other stuff out. So the answer is, depending on the technology that you have, is it possible? Absolutely, but it depends on the technology.
Okay.
I think, sorry, can I just add to that? So if you're using thermomechanical or just mechanical shredding, then those chemicals will almost certainly survive the process.
Yeah.
Whereas using any of the chemical recycling technologies, they will be removed.
Yeah. I mean, Shivam, you were nodding. Do you have anything else to add, or did we? I think Patrick covered it perfectly well there.
I agree with Patrick on that. Of course, it's a engineering and a chemistry problem which can be solved. We have the best chemistries and everything else, and we can separate the molecules. It's the only caveat I bring is the more complex it is, the more pre-processing you do, the more impact it goes up. So it goes back to trade-offs. If you want it very clean, which we obviously want because we don't want contaminated material going back, so that's why we might have to we can't solve for all waste. We might be able to solve for some waste. After a certain point, the financial sense it doesn't make financial sense to remove even more because you can keep doing steps to purify it. After a point, it doesn't make monetary sense or environmental sense. Hence, it's possible. We can make very clean recycled materials, but we'll have to understand the trade-offs.
Perfect, thank you. I also like this positivity that anything is possible. So thanks, Shivam. Do we have one more question from the audience? Yes, we do.
Hi. So I'm working for a German suiting brand, and we are currently already using a lot of recycled wool. But our problem is basically that we can only use the recycled wool for coats or knitwear stuff because it's not fine enough for our suits. So my question would be if there is like any kind of improvement planned in the near future to maybe adjust the recycling process so we can also use the recycled wool for our suits in the future.
Good question. Adam?
Well, I can only speak to a recycler we've spoken to based in Italy who is recycling wool, and I believe actually did a study with Leeds University about the recyclability of wool and found that wool can be recycled up to 7 times whilst maintaining the quality. So we are definitely seeing improvements in mechanical recycling technology to preserve natural fibres through that. And from their testing, again, with those studies, they did see that it compares to virgin in terms of a micron level that it can go down to and fibre strength. There's, of course, going to be trade-offs, but there is technology for those natural systems that is really innovating. And whilst we do speak about advanced chemical recycling, those mechanical recyclers, as well in cotton, are really advancing that technology. I don't know.
And I'm glad we had a question about a different fibre.
Yeah. Sorry, yeah. You mentioned Leeds. The quality of the recycled wool depends on the quality of what goes into the machine. So if you just feed it finest merino, you'll get a great recycled fibre.
Great. So yeah, I'm actually happy that I think a lot of these conversations around recycling, we're so focused on synthetics that we often miss kind of the natural fibres as well. So it's really good to bring that up. Thank you. Do we have time for one more question, or shall we just wrap up the session? Okay. So I think we've had a really interesting conversation here around technologies, what's possible, markets, LCAs. We brought in a lot of different things. And I just want to finish I've got a question for everybody to finish. Your question, Adam, is if you could change one thing tomorrow to accelerate the process. Sorry, it's an awful question. Or what would that be? I mean, what do we need to do as an industry, basically?
I think a lot has been spoken about the desire for commitments, and offtake agreements are often the go-to for recyclers, but we need to think that this is an ecosystem with all stakeholders. We heard about the challenges sorters are facing. So to really change things tomorrow, we need to see that as a system. We won't exist with textile-to-textile recycling if we don't have a feedstock to supply it. And we need to think of that as an ecosystem and how everyone can support each of those stakeholders.
Okay. And that kind of leads on to my question to Simon as well. And I was going to ask Simon, what kind of collaboration across industry and policy do we really need to see? I mean, obviously you kind of touched upon that, but do you have any thoughts, Simon?
Yeah, sure, Katie. Excuse me. Probably oversimplifying terribly for everybody in the room, and there's such diversity of opinion, which is great. But there are probably three things that we'd like to see, Katie. One is the trade, and by that I mean performance days, global fashion agenda, textile exchange, all these kind of industry forums, helping lead us to find out what are the macro issues that are facing us all. There are lots of different sustainability conferences and shows around the world. If we could all align on what those macro issues were, I think that would help in part two, which would then be getting those industry players to help lead investment in infrastructure linked to those key sort of macro issues. And then number three, us as value chain players, then it's clear where the priorities are, and we could hopefully then collaborate more closely in clusters to tackle those problems all together and profit share, whatever you need to do. I'm not trying to create a utopia here, but if we're clear on priorities, we can then arrange resources more effectively and efficiently. So terrible oversimplification, but that's what I'd like to see in our beautiful system.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's perfect. I mean, we're talking about industry collaboration, dialogue, and just keeping that up. A final question for you, Shivam, from a kind of more technical perspective. What do you see as being the most realistic pathway to scale textile-to-textile recycling over the next 5 or 10 years or so? Like, how do you think what needs to happen technically?
Absolutely. I think maybe to support the technical side, we need to, the industry wants to collaborate and they want to pull in the money, but maybe the money needs to go in for more R&D first. Give the innovators the room to breathe in terms of we just having them push to scale up. Like, we want this, we want that. We want to put in legislation to have minimum targets, and we want to quickly scale up. But the number of unknown variables we have is way too many. And for science to work really well, you can't depend on luck too much. And if you have too many unknown variables, you depend on luck way too much for things to fall into the place. For science to thrive, we need the variables figured out. And for that, we need to do more R&D, more understanding. So if we want recycling to actually scale up and win, give the innovators more time to refine. Give them the support, give them the money if you have to buy them more time for the next 5 years. We can scale up after that as well. There is no requirement for us to scale up today. Of course, we would love for it to happen, but if we keep losing out innovators, which we have lost tens of 20, in the last plastics recycling industry, we've lost more than 1 million tons of recycled capacity because we went too early, we didn't refine systems. So if our whole goal is, okay, we'll bet on 10 and maybe 2 will survive and we'll lose 8, that is not good for the industry. That's bad for the industry. If we want true collaboration, we want all 10 to win because all 10 will do their own bit. And for that to happen, we need to support them in a way that they can truly scale up, not being rushed to get to the market with whatever they can do right now. That is a very, for lack of better way to say it, that's a very tech industry thinking. When you have a software, you can fix bugs on the go. Everyone says, make it right now and then fix on the go. That is not good for capex heavy industries. You can't put $1 billion plant and then see if I can make it happen. No dyeing technology provider is like, I'll make a dyeing machine, put it in a factory, and then maybe start to refine it with the supplier. Nobody will buy that. You refine, you do a lot of trials, you make sure that dyeing is perfect, and then you start going to the market. Same goes with recycling or any big capex industry. It's not a software. We can't go online and fix it if your yield is low. There's no possibility. You'll have to change the pipings, change other things, change contaminants, solve for all of things. So buy them more time is my answer, is don't rush them.
Perfect. That's a great answer, I think. So great. I think we've had a great conversation here. We've unpacked some really important topics. And I think we've heard overall that collaboration, systems perspective, and a little bit extra time is what we're looking for. So thank you to the panelists, and thank you to Charles for the opportunity to be here, and wishing you all a great lunchtime.
Can we show our appreciation for the panel, please? We have been ever so fortunate. I'm just going to embarrass all 4 members of the panel now, but it's what Charles does. Katie works for the European Outdoor Group, so she's at the middle of the ISPO announcement that was made yesterday. Adam was in Guyana last week. Shivam's in India because he couldn't get a visa, and Simon's got COVID. The fact that 4 of them make time to come to this show, virtually or in person, we are really grateful. Thank you very much. What we're going to do now, we're going to let them go off stage. We're going to have a lunch break.